Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Texas Insider TV, brought to you by the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. I'm Jim Cardle. What is the real story behind the news gathering in the Hillary Clinton email server scandal? And how do many news agencies or increasingly independent watchdog groups gather such information? It's called the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, as commonly referred to. And today we're pleased to be able to visit with one of the leading national experts on the issue. Daniel Schuman brings together law, policy, and technology through his organization known as Demand Progress. DemandProgress.org is based in Washington, D.C., and Daniel has experience both on the policy side, working for the Sunlight Foundation, as well as a unique perspective having worked for the Congressional Research Service, which is the think tank of Congress on issues all across the political board. We're pleased to be able to visit with Daniel Schuman today and find out how information is gathered and what are the details behind the Hillary Clinton scandal. Daniel, thanks for joining us and coming in today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
As I mentioned, you are a nationally recognized and known expert, Demand Progress, making great strides on issues other than what we're talking about today. You recently visited and were good enough to talk about the FBI and Apple issue. But let's here talk about something that is somewhat esoteric but yet so critical and crucial to what folks read in the newspaper, how the news is gathered, how government agencies and wrongdoing is exposed, and that's the Freedom of Information Act, commonly known or seen in the press as FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. You in Washington deal in acronyms.
Yes, we do.
But just tell us, to get started off, thumbnail sketch, what is the Freedom of Information Act and why is it important?
So the Freedom of Information Act essentially enshrines the public's right to know. We have a right to know what our government does, and FOIA makes it possible to do so. You can file a request with federal agencies and say, I'm curious about whatever. You could be curious about aliens, people like to file with that, or you could be curious about things that actually are real, like government malfeasance, or you could be interested in plans for the EPA. It turns out people file FOIA requests all the time because they want to find out what their government does, and this is the mechanism by which they can do so.
It's become more of importance or more discussed these days, perhaps as the internet's come along. There are watchdog organizations springing up in states and in the nation's capital. Primarily it's been utilized by the press. What are some of the best examples you have of watchdog in particular, which you are one, watching out for citizens' demands up in Washington? What are some of the more creative recent examples or issues that have been exposed by Freedom of Information Act?
Well, so, it covers everything. You can open up your newspaper, or I guess read it online nowadays, without finding an article or two that only are possible because of the results of Freedom of Information Act requests. Now, something that's been in news recently on the state level, but it's the same kind of law, has been the poisoning that's taken place in Flint, Michigan.
Absolutely.
So we've seen, of course, that the government decided to divert the water that has lead in it that's causing massive and life-changing medical problems for the kids who live there. So the government officials knew what was going on, but they said that they didn't. But when they filed Freedom of Information request, they were able to get the emails to show how the decision was made, who was responsible for it, and sort of the processes that took place there. And this happens all the time. Freedom of information is the linchpin of the public's right to know. And this is how we find out what our government is doing for the things that they don't necessarily want to tell us about or issue a press release on.
So you've had Watergate back in the 70s. Aaron Brockovich was a popular movie. Scooter Libby in the last George W. Bush administration. You mentioned Flint, Michigan. What are some of the latest efforts that perhaps you or some of your peers up in Washington, D.C. are exploring, or give us some examples there?
Sure. You mean in terms of investigations or in
Yes.
terms of... well, so there's from the political to government So one of the questions that you had asked initially was who uses FOIA.
Okay.
It turns out that businesses use FOIA all the time. There are actually more business requesters for FOIA than there are newspaper requesters or watchdogs. And the reason why is government gathers tremendous amounts of information that's useful to commerce.
Okay.
businesses FOIA the government for information about everything from how are drug processes moving along to things like where are the best places to engage with trade. So this is information that fuels our economy as well as providing oversight of what's going on. So, it's everything that you can possibly imagine and more.
Gotcha. Again, folks, I want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Texas Insider TV. We're visiting with Daniel Schuman from the demandprogress.org organization. Daniel, you mentioned to me before coming on air that there is a significant update. There's a bill in Congress. Our local Senator local Senator John Cornyn has been a big advocate of FOIA. Tell me what you're working on legislatively at the moment.
So there's really exciting news. Senator Cornyn, along with Senator Grassley from Iowa and Senator Patrick Leahy from Vermont, have been working on a FOIA bill that is poised to pass the Senate. This is a transformative bill. FOIA is 50 years old this year. It is, as we discussed before, an incredibly useful bill, but we've seen problems in its implementation over time. As much as you try to set the dial to being open, you have bureaucrats and other folks who try to turn it back to being closed. So what the FOIA bill does is it pushes things back in the direction that they need to be to make sure that people can get access to the information they need. Whether you care about Hillary Clinton's emails, that some people care about, or whether you care about the government trying to hide, cover up toxic waste spills that come on military facilities, for example. All of these are the kinds of things that you can find out through FOIA, and Senator Cornyn has been leading the fight with Senators Grassley and Leahy to address some of the problems that we've seen crop up over the last 10 or 15 years, and to really make sure that this is legislation that works in the internet age and something that works for everyone.
You mentioned Hillary Clinton. Let me go down that rabbit trail a little bit since it is in the news. Clearly, she has lately, I think, been accepted by the general public. Clearly, in the press, she has been accepted as setting up a separate system other than the Secretary of State's office, which she would have controlled that system anyway, frankly. But she set this up to hide her activities, hide her corporate activities and her personal activities. What are the implications of this Hillary Clinton case on FOIA, as it was discovered probably by FOIA? But talk about, I'm sure you've been up to speed on that one. Talk about the implications of the Hillary Clinton and why she might have done something there.
So what many organizations do, including one that I used to work for, is we went and we file for agency records. So we're looking for things like communications that go to the heads of agencies. And so my prior employer filed a FOIA request for her records, and we came back, the response was there are no responsive records, which is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So we started looking into it more deeply. This isn't just her, right? This is common. People who tend to run these agencies tend to think that they're above these types of disclosures, or they're afraid of the political consequences.
Okay.
One of the reasons FOIA exists is to help encourage people to draw within the lines, to stay and do things that are appropriate. And we've seen in response, administrators will get additional email addresses while they're inside the agency. So you might email for hillary.clinton@state.gov, but they actually have John Smith, and you would never think that this is the person. And that's what we were looking at, as we had heard about officials using inappropriate aliases. What we never suspected was that some folks would go entirely off government email entirely,
okay,
and create these types of home-brew servers that violate the spirit of FOIA and are an effort, it seems, to avoid accountability. It's unclear where the investigation is going. DOJ is looking into it. In these types of political cases, you're not, assuming that there was illegality, and we don't know, you won't see an indictment or anything like that most likely until after the election, just because it would have such a significant event, and DOJ is unlikely to try to have those kinds of political consequences to the prosecutions that they may or may not bring. But that being said, the ultimate accountability for trying to be secret is something that the American people and the citizens of each state need to decide for themselves. And we need to demand better of our public officials, that they need to operate in the open to the maximum extent possible. And this is a violation of that principle.
Okay, so you're an expert in this field. You see an elected official or an appointed official, somebody of prominent national security even, they set up something separate. What would be, in your opinion, the motivation behind that? And secondly, how hard does it make the FOIA process compared to the public sector agency versus a private server?
Well, it makes it impossible. The FOIA officers inside an agency won't have access to this information, nor do they have control over this information. So they're entirely reliant on the person who is running it to be responsive and to provide the information in response to FOIA requests. And that is simply a system that does not work right. In fact, Obama has come out and said that folks are not supposed to use these types of homebrew systems, that you're supposed to use the government operation. Now, one thing that the secretary had said was that they were having problems with the State Department's email system, so they did this as a matter of convenience. Well, if you run an agency and you find out that the email system doesn't work well, then maybe you should fix the email system at the agency instead of trying to cut yourself out of it from everyone else. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And just to give you sort of one more example of the types of things that FOIA is used for, there is an office inside the Department of Justice called the Office of Legal Counsel.
Okay.
These are the folks who write legal memos that guide what the government can and cannot do. These are the folks who wrote the infamous torture memo. These are the folks who wrote the memo on drones being able to kill U.S. citizens overseas.
Okay.
They don't make their opinions available to the public.
Fairly significant issues you're talking about there.
Yes, it's everything from whether the president can sign a law remotely using an auto pen to whether to the scope of the type of surveillance that is permissible or not. FOIA has been the mechanism by which we've gotten access to many, but not all of these opinions. FOIA provides insight. When government officials are doing something they're proud of, they'll issue a press release. When they have classified information that they want out to the public, they'll find a way to leak it out. But when there are watchdogs that come forward, when there's things that they don't necessarily want folks to see, FOIA is one of the few mechanisms that are able to push at least some of this information out so that when we go to the voting booths in November, we can make a determination about who is serving us well and who else we would want instead.
Okay, one more attempt here to try and get your opinion on the Hillary dynamic. She is, a lot of folks think, experts on talking heads on national news stations saying that it might come out in the next month or two. But again, in terms of why she would do this and what the implications are going to be on this election, talk about your opinion of how information is gathered and if there's enough information so far, or if she's been effective at fighting it off.
Well, I mean, it's an effort to fight accountability. That people take their information out of a space where they can be held accountable for just that very reason. It is possible that we may see some indictments coming down maybe for other folks. I would imagine that the people that are engaging the prosecutions are unlikely to do something prior to the election, just because of the effects that it would have on the election. We've seen this in other prosecutions as well. We saw this with Ted Stevens. We've seen this with other high-profile political figures, that when there are elections at stake, they tend not to act in the run up to the election. What are the criminal penalties that would apply here? I mean, there's a lot of sort of unsettled legal territory here, so we don't really know the answer to it. As a citizen, what I would suggest is that when you look to vote for your senator or your congressman or your the folks who are elected to your state legislature, you should look to see whether they believe that the public have a right to know. They should look to see whether they're willing to put their money where their mouth is, and make sure that there's strong public access to information about where all federal spending and state spending is going. Who gets the contracts about building? Is it their buddies, or is it someone who won a competitive bidding process? These kinds of information, these sets of information, is incredibly crucial to everyone. This is why we are so appreciative of Senator Cornyn, Senator Grassley, and Senator Leahy, and folks on the House side. Darrell Issa, for example, has been a champion of this issue, as has Elijah Cummings, who's a Democrat from Maryland.
Okay.
They have been fantastic on trying to push these things forward over the opposition of many inside the administration who do not want this disclosure. In fact, and I think you'll appreciate this irony, this FOIA bill that we hope will make it out this week was going to come up in the last Congress. In fact, we got it out of the House. It almost passed the Senate. Just last week, we had FOIA'd the DOJ's position on this, and they have been circulating a 6-page memo that went through the talking points in opposition to this FOIA bill. Now, this FOIA bill, major parts of it were taken from the administration's own positions, their own stated positions on FOIA. So the president's own Department of Justice was going around and lobbying, ostensibly behind his back, to undermine the codification of the principles that they themselves believe in like a presumption of openness, that when in doubt, you should make information available to the public. This is the kind of stuff that we're fighting against, is this sort of two-faced effort where on the one hand you say, we really believe this is important, and then on the other hand, they go and lobby Congress to try to prevent open government, open information laws. So,
in the most open administration, supposedly, which all administrations have been saying. So, one final question I was going to ask about the opposition. You've got the press, you've got citizen watchdog groups. You mentioned the law is 50 years old, obviously needs updating. Who are some of the opponents, or what is the opposition to, in fact, something so commonsensical it appears actually being enacted?
So it basically people who feel that their ox is getting gored, right? So you have the intelligence establishment who's afraid of this. Now, even though it doesn't affect classified information, if information is properly classified, this FOIA bill will not make it available to the public. But yet they're concerned about other things that are not classified, that are not otherwise protected, that might come available. Is there any basis for this concern? Not really. They're out there protecting information about the Bay of Pigs. You know, was that 1961, 1962?
A long time ago.
It's a long time, and they're protecting it under the principle of deliberative process. That this would affect the ability of the Kennedy administration to engage in deliberations about the activity of that administration. We're so far. I mean, those folks. It's no longer an issue for the people who served in that administration, right? That is one piece of the opposition that we're getting. The second one is that when you create a presumption of openness that is actually actionable by the courts, you can no longer simply pay lip service. You have somebody looking over your shoulder. It is not uncommon for the agency's first response to requests to be denied. We're not going to give you this information. We're not going to give it to you. We don't have it. It's not available. You don't have a right to it. But when you have the courts able to provide a second look, it changes the way the agencies behave. It means that they can't take this position of deny.
And that's one of the key positions, I believe, of this bill is presumption of openness and disclosure, correct?
That's exactly right. So this bill does three major things. One is it enshrines the presumption of openness, so that what we saw, unfortunately, under the last administration, for example, there was a presumption of closure. Right? There was a Cheney that came from the Bush administration, memo that came from the Bush administration that said, withhold it if you can find any possible reason to do so. That is antithetical to the purpose of the law and the ideas behind responsive government to the citizens. So that's sort of one thing that bill does. The second thing that does is there is an oversight office called the Office of Government Information Services. You know I'm from DC, so the acronym, of course, is OGIS.
Yes.
This is a watchdog, and their job is to provide advice to Congress and to keep an eye on the Department of Justice's implementation of FOIA laws to make sure that it is done properly. As things are currently set up, OGIS isn't allowed to talk directly to Congress. Their testimony and other things have to go through the White House, which of course creates lots of opportunity for political interference.
Or defeats the purpose at the least.
Yeah, certainly. So this will make it so it's possible for OGIS to talk directly and truthfully and not circumspectly to Congress about what the problems are.
Okay.
The third thing that it does is we talked earlier about this deliberative process privilege, which is basically that you can say that this is part of the formulation of the way we're doing business, so we shouldn't tell you because it'll chill our conversations.
In a current situation, right. Current administration.
So this says after 25 years, the presumption, this deliberative process privilege no longer applies. Now, just by comparison, for presidential records, these privileges all go away after 12 years.
Okay.
So this is twice as long as that, and it will ensure that if you're looking for the Bay of Pigs, so it's 25 years, so you'll be able to get early Reagan administration materials.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine that President Reagan at this point would have any objection to some of the information about the activities of his administration or the agencies inside. It's not going to change the conversation. This is literally a career. This is a lifetime later, right? People who were working then largely are retired at this point. This is not going to change the advice that they give. This will make sure that we can see what has happened so that when we're trying to make our government work better for all of us, we can learn the lessons of history.
Well, speaking of making the government work, we know that's your regular day job, and we're going to leave it there and let you get back to further efforts on the FOIA issue, Freedom of Information. Daniel, we appreciate you coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
Again, folks, Daniel Schuman with demandprogress.org. Be sure and give them a look. They are staying after the government and looking out for our interests on a daily basis. We will be talking about it in the future and hope you'll come back to join us again. My name is Jim Cardle. You're either an insider or you're not. Thanks for joining us.